The first time I was certain, truly certain that I wasn't losing my mind, was the day I came home to find every chair in my house facing the wall. Not just turned around, but positioned with a kind of meticulous, deliberate precision. The big, overstuffed armchair in the living room, its floral pattern now staring blankly at the drywall. The four simple wooden chairs around my small kitchen table, each one forming a perfect, silent row, their backs to the center of the room. Even the worn-out ergonomic chair in my home office, the one I spent a small fortune on, was swiveled 180 degrees, aimed at the corner like a disciplined child. The sight didn't make me scream. It didn't even make me gasp. It just stopped the air in my lungs. It was so quiet, so absurd, and so deeply, deeply wrong that my mind simply refused to process it for a long, silent moment. I stood there in the doorway, my work bag slipping from my shoulder, and just stared. All I could hear was the faint, apologetic hum of the old refrigerator, and the frantic, bird-like thumping of my own heart against my ribs. My life up until that point had been built on a foundation of predictable, comforting routine. I live alone in a small, two-bedroom rental bungalow on the far west side of Portland, Oregon. It's the kind of neighborhood where the houses are just a little too close together, and the lawns are a 50-50 mix of manicured green and dandelion-choked wilderness. My house was one of the latter. It was old, built sometime in the 50s, and it carried the gentle scent of damp wood, old dust, and the ghosts of countless past tenants. I'm an architectural drafter for a mid-sized firm downtown. My job is precision. I spend 8, sometimes 10 hours a day staring at a high-resolution monitor, manipulating lines and numbers, ensuring that a support beam is placed a specific number of millimeters from a load-bearing wall, that a ventilation shaft has the proper clearance. My world is one of grids, measurements, and absolute order. My routine was the scaffolding that held this world together. I'd wake up at 6:15 a.m. Not 6:14, not 6:16. The alarm would sound, a gentle chime that I'd carefully selected to not be jarring. I'd make coffee in the same French press I'd owned since college, using exactly 2.5 scoops of dark roast. I'd sit in that big, overstuffed armchair, the one that would eventually be turned against me, and watch the gray, misty Oregon morning slowly brighten through the large picture window. I'd leave the house at 7:30 a.m., locking the deadbolt and then pulling on the handle 3 times. It wasn't an obsession, just a habit, a confirmation. The drive to work was 25 minutes of public radio, a calm, disembodied voice talking about global economics or migratory bird patterns. Work was work. A quiet hum of computers and the soft scratch of styluses on tablets. I'd eat lunch at my desk, a sandwich I'd made the night before. At 5:00 p.m., I'd pack my bag, say a few muted goodbyes, and drive home, listening to a different calm, disembodied voice. The evening was a mirror of the morning, a simple dinner, an hour of television or reading, and then bed by 10:30 p.m. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was mine. It was ordered. It was safe. The first crack in that foundation was so small I almost missed it. I came home one Tuesday, exhausted after a long day wrestling with a particularly stubborn HVAC layout. I dropped my keys in the small ceramic bowl by the door, just like always, and went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. And that's when I saw it. My favorite coffee mug, a heavy ceramic thing with a chipped rim that my sister had made in a pottery class, was sitting on the left side of the sink. I distinctly remembered leaving it on the right side that morning where it always sat, waiting to be washed. I stood there for a second, frowning. It was off, but it was also nothing. A tired mind plays tricks. I must have moved it myself and forgotten. Of course, that was it. I was just overworked. I dismissed it, washed the mug, and thought nothing more of it. A few days later, it was something else. I went into my bedroom to change out of my work clothes. The book on my nightstand, a dense history of urban planning I'd been slogging through for weeks, was lying face down. I never leave books face down, it damages the spine. I always use a bookmark. My thin, red ribbon bookmark was still tucked inside, about a third of the way through, but the book itself was inverted, splayed open on the table. A small, cold knot tightened in my stomach. Again, the rationalizations came flooding in. Maybe I knocked it over when I hit the alarm this morning. Maybe a truck rumbled by and the vibration shifted it. The explanations felt thin, even to me, but the alternative, that someone had been in my house, had picked up my book, and had set it down wrong, was so utterly unthinkable that my brain refused to even entertain it. It was easier to believe in a localized, book-specific earthquake than to accept that. The incidents continued, small and infrequent like a dripping faucet in the dead of night. They were always minor, always just on the edge of plausible deniability. One morning I found a single spice jar, cumin, which I hadn't used in months, moved from the very back of the spice rack to the very front. Another time, the remote control for my television, which I always left on the arm of the sofa, was tucked neatly between the cushions. I started to feel a low-grade hum of anxiety that never quite went away. The drive home from work, once a period of decompression, became a time of tense anticipation. What would it be today? What small, insignificant detail of my life would be altered? I started doing little things, setting traps for my own sanity. Before I'd leave for work, I'd arrange the pens on my desk in a specific pattern. I'd make sure the throw pillows on the sofa were angled just so. I started taking a picture of my kitchen counter with my phone each morning, a silent, digital record of my reality. It was the photo that proved I wasn't crazy. I came home on a Thursday, my stomach already churning with a familiar dread. The house was silent still, everything looked normal. The pens on my desk were untouched, the pillows were perfect. I felt a wave of relief so powerful it made me dizzy. See, I told myself, it's all in your head, you're just stressed. Then I walked into the kitchen. On the wooden knife block, the large chef's knife was lying on its side on the counter, a few inches away from its slot. Its blade gleamed under the fluorescent light. My blood went cold. I had a photo. I pulled out my phone, my hand shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. I swiped to the picture I had taken that morning at 7:28 a.m. In the photo, the knife was safely in its block. Now it was out. It wasn't a threat, not really. It wasn't plunged into the wall or dripping with anything sinister. It was just moved, an object taken from its place of order and left in a state of disorder. But the message was clear. I was here. I can touch your things. I can touch your knives. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room in the dark, clutching a heavy flashlight, listening. Every sound the old house made was magnified, personified. The groan of the water heater in the basement was the sound of a footstep on the stairs. The rattle of a window pane in the wind was the sound of a lock being jimmied. The house, my sanctuary, had transformed into a foreign country where I no longer knew the language. It was breathing around me, and its breath wasn't friendly. Silence was the worst part. The long, heavy stretches of absolute quiet where my imagination ran wild, populating the darkness in the hallway, the space under my bed, the deep shadows in the corners of the room. I started to feel a creeping paranoia that leached into every corner of my life. At work, I'd find myself staring at my colleagues, wondering, could it be Dave from accounting, the one who always seemed a little too eager to talk, or Sarah from marketing, who lived only a few blocks away? My mind became a labyrinth of suspicion. Everyone was a suspect. Everything was a potential clue. I was becoming unmoored from reality, and I knew it. The exhaustion was like a physical weight. Dark, bruised-looking circles formed under my eyes. I lost my appetite, my focus at work shattered. My boss, a kind, middle-aged man named Mr. Henderson, pulled me aside one afternoon. "Alex," he said, his voice gentle, "everything okay? You seem distracted lately. Your line work isn't as clean as it usually is." I just nodded, mumbling something about not sleeping well. How could I possibly explain it? "I think someone is breaking into my house every day, not to steal anything, but to move my spice jars and turn my books upside down. They wouldn't call the police. They'd call a psychiatrist." The isolation was absolute. This was my secret, my own private haunting, and it was eating me alive from the inside out. I started reinforcing my home. I added a chain lock to the front door and a heavy slide bolt to the back. I made sure every window was not just closed but locked tight. I'd go through the house every night, a ritual of checking and rechecking, my hand on each lock, pushing, confirming. But it didn't help. The changes continued. One day, a single photograph was altered. It was a framed picture on my mantelpiece of my parents and me at the Grand Canyon when I was 10. My mother and father were gone now, and that photo was one of my most treasured possessions. When I got home, the photo was turned around in its frame, its blank cardboard backing facing out. I felt a surge of violation so profound it was like a physical blow. This was different. This wasn't just moving an object. This was an erasure. It was an attack on my memory, on my past. It was a violation of something sacred. The next day I found a single, clean sock, one of mine, placed carefully on the center of my pillow, laid out as if it were a gift. The day after that, all the cabinet doors in the kitchen were left wide open, a silent, gaping chorus. The intrusions were becoming more frequent, more blatant. The sense of plausible deniability was long gone, replaced by a certainty that was far more terrifying than the doubt had been. I was being toyed with. It felt like a psychological experiment, and I was the rat in the maze. My home, the one place I was supposed to feel unconditionally safe, had become the maze itself. Which brings me back to the chairs. I stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, my keys still in my hand, my work bag on the floor. The sheer theatrical absurdity of it was what finally broke through my fear-induced paralysis. It was a statement. It was a punchline to a joke I didn't understand. I walked slowly, cautiously into the house, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the hardwood floors. I circled the living room, looking at the back of my armchair. I went into the kitchen and stared at the 4 wooden backs, all perfectly aligned. It was a display. It was art in the most terrifying way possible. There was no rage in it, no violence. Just a calm, methodical, and utterly insane rearrangement of my world. That was the night I bought the camera. I drove to a big-box electronics store in a daze, the fluorescent lights feeling harsh and surreal. I bought a simple, cheap Wi-Fi security camera, the kind people use to check on their pets. I didn't want a permanent system. I just wanted proof. I needed something tangible to show the police, to show someone so they wouldn't think I was crazy. I set it up on the bookshelf in my living room, angling it so it had a clear view of the front door, the living room itself, and the entrance to the kitchen. It was small and unobtrusive, a little black plastic eye that would be my silent witness. That night, for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope, a sense of empowerment. I was taking control. I would catch them. The next morning, I went through my routine with a nervous energy buzzing under my skin. I made my coffee. I sat in the armchair, which I had turned back around, and forced myself to drink it slowly. I checked the camera's app on my phone. The little green light was on. It was recording. The live feed showed my empty living room, silent and still. I left for work at 7:30 a.m., locking the deadbolt, pulling the handle 3 times. The entire drive to work, my phone was propped on the passenger seat, the live feed playing. It was like watching the world's most boring movie. My empty living room. The sun shifted, and a patch of light crawled across the floor. Nothing. At work, I was useless. I couldn't focus on the blueprints on my screen. My eyes kept darting down to my phone, which I kept in my lap under the desk. I refreshed the feed every few minutes. 9:00 a.m. Nothing. 10:30 a.m. My empty living room. A car drove by outside the window, its shadow briefly passing through the room. My heart leaped into my throat, but that was all it was. A shadow. 12:15 p.m. I ate my sandwich at my desk, my eyes glued to the tiny screen. The house was a perfect still life painting. 2:40 p.m. Nothing. 4:00 p.m. Still nothing. A new thought began to creep into my mind, a thought that was somehow even more terrifying than the alternative. What if nothing happened? What if the camera, my one hope for validation, showed nothing? What if the one day I was watching, the activity stopped? Did that mean they knew? Or did it mean it really was all in my head, a product of stress and grief and loneliness, and the camera's presence was enough to shock my subconscious back into line? I felt a wave of nausea. At 5:00 p.m., I packed my bag in a fog. The feed was still clear. My living room was exactly as I had left it. I felt a bizarre mix of profound relief and crushing disappointment. The drive home was the longest of my life. The dread was back, but it was different now. It was the dread of the unknown answer. I pulled into my driveway, the house looking as placid and unassuming as ever. I cut the engine, and the silence that rushed in was absolute. I sat in my car for a full 5 minutes, just staring at the front door. I took a deep, shuddering breath and got out. I unlocked the deadbolt. It felt normal. I turned the knob. It felt normal. The house was quiet. I stepped inside, my heart hammering against the wall of my chest, and I saw it. The bookshelf. The camera was gone from its perch. I scanned the room, a frantic, wild-eyed search, and then I saw it on the floor about 10 feet from the bookshelf. It was lying on its back, its little black lens aimed at the textured white plaster of the ceiling. It looked like a dead bug. I rushed over to it, my breath catching in my throat. The power cord was still plugged into the wall, but it had been pulled taut. The camera itself felt cold. I picked it up. There was a small slot in the side for a microSD card, the card where it stored all its recordings. The slot was empty. The card was gone. A cold, heavy understanding washed over me, so absolute and chilling it felt like being submerged in icy water. They hadn't just been in my house. They had seen the camera. They had approached it, unplugged it from its power source on the back, taken the SD card, and then tossed the useless plastic shell onto the floor. They knew I was watching, and they had taken my proof. They had stolen my memory, my witness. They had left me with nothing but my own frantic, unbelievable story. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't empty. It was watchful. It was triumphant. It felt heavy, occupied. I was not alone. And whoever was with me, this silent, methodical ghost, was now standing in the room with me, figuratively at least. They were watching me react. I backed away from the camera slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows in the hallway, the dark maw of the kitchen entrance. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the house and never come back. But a different part of me, a stubborn, terrified part, needed to know. I had to see what else they had done. It was a compulsion, the same way you can't help but touch a sore tooth. I had to know the extent of the violation. My feet felt like lead as I walked through the living room. Everything appeared to be in its place. The chairs were facing the right way. The pillows were neat. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was the same in the kitchen. No open cabinets, no misplaced knives. It was almost disappointing. Had they just come in for the camera? Was that the only message this time? We see you too. Then I walked down the long, narrow hallway toward my bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, just as I'd left it. A thin slice of gray afternoon light cut across the wooden floor. I pushed the door open, my hand trembling. The air in the room was cold, stagnant. My bed was neatly made. The book was still on the nightstand, right side up. The photo of my parents on the dresser was facing forward. Everything was normal. I took a step into the room, then another, my eyes darting around, searching for the small, wrong detail. And then I saw it. In the very center of the floor, placed on the worn, faded Persian rug, was a boot. Just one, a man's work boot. It was old, caked in mud and what looked like dried leaves. The leather was scuffed and cracked, the laces frayed. It was a left boot. It was not mine. I had never seen it before in my life. It was just sitting there in the middle of my bedroom as if it had been placed on a pedestal. It was an offering, a statement, a piece of evidence that was also a taunt. Unlike my things which had been moved and rearranged, this was an addition, an invasion. This object, this dirty, worn-out thing from the outside world, had been brought into the most private space of my home and left there. I stared at that boot and my entire world collapsed into that single, filthy object. All the questions I'd been asking myself for weeks, who was doing this? Why were they doing it? Evaporated, replaced by a single, crushing certainty. The why didn't matter, the who was unknowable. The only thing that mattered was the what. And the what was that my life was no longer my own. A stranger had the keys to my house, to my life, to my sanity. They could come and go as they pleased. They could touch my things. They could watch me. They could leave parts of themselves behind for me to find. The boot wasn't a threat of future violence. It was a declaration of ownership. This place is mine now. You are just living in it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even breathe. I just backed out of the room slowly, one step at a time, my eyes locked on that solitary, muddy boot. I backed down the hallway through the living room. I didn't take my bag. I didn't take my wallet from the ceramic bowl. I fumbled behind my back for the doorknob, my fingers clumsy and numb. I twisted it, pulled the door open, and stumbled out onto my porch into the cool, damp air of the late afternoon. I didn't look back. I got in my car, my keys already in my hand, and I drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove. I ended up at a cheap motel on the other side of the river, a grimy place with a flickering neon sign and the smell of stale cigarette smoke embedded in the walls. I used the credit card I kept in my glove compartment for emergencies. This, I decided, was an emergency. I locked the door, bolted the chain, and wedged the room's flimsy chair under the knob. I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the stiff, scratchy bed and stared at the wall. The image of that boot burned into the back of my eyelids. The next morning, I called the police. I told the story to a tired, patient-sounding officer over the phone. I tried to make it sound coherent, logical. I told him about the the book, the chairs, the camera, and finally the boot. He listened. He even sounded sympathetic. He sent a patrol car to the house. I met them there, standing on the sidewalk, unable to bring myself to go inside. The two officers went in. They were inside for maybe 15 minutes. When they came out, their faces were professionally blank. There were no signs of forced entry, they said. Nothing was stolen. They had found the boot, of course. They put it in an evidence bag. But a single, muddy boot wasn't much to go on. There were no fingerprints they could find, no other disturbances. They took my statement. They gave me a case number and a pamphlet on victim support services. They told me to call if anything else happened. And then they left. I never spent another night in that house. I called my landlord, a gruff, unsentimental man, and told him I was breaking my lease. He grumbled about the lost rent and keeping my security deposit, but I don't think he heard the frantic edge in my voice. I didn't care. It was just money. I hired a moving company and told them to pack up everything. I couldn't bear to do it myself, to touch the things that had been touched by someone else. I stood on the street and watched as they carried my life out in cardboard boxes. My armchair, my books, my clothes, my whole ordered existence, dismantled and put onto a truck. I told them to put it all in storage. I didn't want any of it near me. I live in a new apartment now. It's a modern, sterile high-rise downtown, the kind of place with keycard entry and a security guard in the lobby. It is the antithesis of my old house. There are no creaks, no strange sounds. The silence here is a dead, empty thing, the hum of the central air conditioning its only pulse. I own almost nothing. A mattress on the floor, a folding chair, a laptop. I work from home now. I told my boss I couldn't handle the commute. He agreed, probably out of pity. But the fear didn't stay in the old house. It followed me here. It lives inside me now. I have 3 separate locks on my apartment door. I check them constantly. Before I go to sleep, if I can sleep, I check them 5, 6, 7 times. I've developed routines that are no longer comforting but frantic. I take pictures of my empty apartment before I leave, just for the 10 minutes it takes to go to the corner store. I can't stand silence. I have the television on all the time, just for the noise, the illusion of other people. But I can't watch dramas or movies because I find myself watching the background, the set design, looking for objects that have been moved between shots. My world has become a game of spot the difference. The police never called me back. The case is cold, buried in a file cabinet somewhere. There was no resolution, no confrontation, no explanation, and that is the cruelest part. I am left with the endless, looping question: who? Why? Was it a stranger, a neighbor, a ghost of my own making, born of loneliness and stress? I don't know. I will never know. Sometimes I think that's what they wanted, to not be found, to simply implant a sliver of ice in my heart that will never melt. Sometimes in my new, empty apartment I'll see something. A pen on my desk will be at a slightly different angle than I remember leaving it. A carton of milk in the refrigerator will be shifted an inch to the left, and the panic comes roaring back, hot and suffocating. I'll feel my heart begin to race, my palms slick with sweat. Is it happening again, or is this just the ghost of the fear itself? Am I so traumatized that I'm now creating the disturbances myself, my own mind reenacting the horror? I don't know, and I have to live with that. I have to live with the knowledge that the safest place in the world can become a stage for a quiet, methodical, and inexplicable horror, and that the person you trusted most, yourself, can become the most unreliable narrator of all. The rearranger is gone, but the rearrangement of my mind is permanent.